Imagine waking up in a small medieval town hundreds of years ago. The streets are quiet, the air is cold, and the day is just beginning. People slowly start preparing for work, just as they do today. But the jobs they are heading to might seem almost unbelievable to us. One person walks through dark streets carrying a long wooden stick. His task is to tap on people's windows and wake them up for work before the sun rises. Another person spends hours standing in cold rivers and ponds, allowing small worms to attach themselves to their legs. These worms will later be sold to doctors as medical tools. And somewhere inside a royal palace, a trusted servant waits outside the king's private chamber, ready to assist the ruler during one of the most personal moments of his daily routine. These jobs may sound strange or even ridiculous today, but for centuries they were real professions performed by real people. Life in the past was very different from life today. Cities were smaller, technology was limited, and many everyday problems had to be solved through human labor rather than machines or inventions. Because of this, societies created jobs that modern people might never imagine. Some of these professions were unpleasant, some were dangerous, and some were simply strange. But each of them reveals something fascinating about how people lived in the past. In this video, we will explore some of the most unusual and surprising jobs that once existed. From royal court positions to dangerous work in dark sewers, these professions show us a side of history that is rarely discussed, and they remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, wars, and famous leaders. It is also shaped by ordinary people performing the strange, difficult, and sometimes uncomfortable work that kept their communities running. So let's take a journey into the past and discover some of the most unusual jobs people once had. One of the strangest and most surprising jobs in royal history existed inside the royal courts of England. It was known as the Groom of the Stool. At first glance, the title itself sounds unusual, and the responsibilities connected with it may seem even more surprising to modern audiences. The Groom of the Stool was responsible for assisting the king during one of the most private moments of his daily routine, using the toilet. In medieval times, toilets inside castles and palaces were very different from what we know today. They were often simple wooden seats placed above a vertical shaft built into the stone walls of the castle. Waste would fall down through the shaft and eventually be removed outside the building. Because kings were constantly surrounded by servants, guards, and court officials, their daily lives were highly organized and carefully managed. Even the most personal activities were often handled with the assistance of trusted servants. The Groom of the Stool was responsible for preparing the king's private chamber, bringing water and cloths, and assisting with clothing before and after the king used the toilet. To people today, this role might sound embarrassing or humiliating. However, in the royal court, it was considered an extremely prestigious and important position. The reason for this was simple. The Groom of the Stool spent time alone with the king every single day. In a royal court filled with ambitious nobles, advisors, and political rivals, very few people had the opportunity to speak privately with the monarch. But the Groom of the Stool had regular access to the king in a relaxed and informal setting. Over time, many of these men became trusted confidants of the ruler. During these quiet moments, the king might speak openly about personal concerns, political matters, or important decisions. The groom often listened to conversations that no one else at court was allowed to hear. Because of this close relationship, the Groom of the Stool sometimes gained surprising political influence. In certain periods of English history, the position became so important that powerful members of the nobility actively competed to obtain it. Some grooms were later promoted to high-ranking government positions. Others were trusted to manage royal finances or act as messengers between the king and powerful political figures. What may appear today as a strange and uncomfortable job was, in reality, one of the most trusted and influential positions in the royal household. The story of the Groom of the Stool reminds us that life in royal courts was often far more complex than it appears in historical paintings or films. And it also shows how, in history, even the most unexpected roles could place someone very close to power. Long before alarm clocks existed, waking up early for work was not always easy. In many growing industrial towns, thousands of workers needed to arrive at factories before sunrise. Being late could mean losing wages or even losing a job. But without clocks in every home, many people had no reliable way to wake up at the right time. To solve this problem, a very unusual profession appeared in several towns across Britain and parts of Ireland. These workers were known as knocker-uppers. A knocker-upper's job was simple but extremely important. Early each morning, often while the streets were still dark and quiet, they walked through neighborhoods waking people for work. They carried long sticks, bamboo poles, or wooden rods. Standing outside a house, they would gently tap on the bedroom window of the person who had hired them. Sometimes the windows were located on the upper floors of narrow brick houses. In those cases, the long pole allowed the knocker-upper to reach the glass from the street. Some workers used another method. Instead of tapping the window, they carried small pebbles and skillfully tossed them at the glass until the sleeper woke up. But their job did not end with the first tap. Knocker-uppers were expected to remain outside the house until the person inside clearly responded. If the sleeper did not react, the tapping continued. This ensured that workers would not fall back asleep and miss the beginning of their shift. For many factory workers, the knocker-upper was their only dependable alarm clock. The job required patience, responsibility, and a very early start to the day. While most people were still asleep, these workers were already walking through dark streets, moving from house to house. In some towns, a single knocker-upper might be responsible for waking dozens of people every morning. Although the profession may sound unusual today, it remained common well into the 19th century. In fact, in certain parts of Britain, knocker-uppers continued working even into the early 20th century. Eventually, inexpensive alarm clocks became widely available, and the strange but practical profession slowly disappeared. Today, the idea of someone walking through the streets each morning to wake people for work may seem almost unbelievable. Yet for generations of workers, the sound of tapping on the window was simply part of everyday life. And it is another reminder that before modern technology, even the simple act of waking up could require an entire profession. Among the many strange professions that once existed in Europe, few were as mysterious and unsettling as the role of the sin-eater. This unusual job appeared mainly in parts of Wales and rural regions of England several centuries ago. It was connected to old beliefs about death, the soul, and what might happen after a person passed away. In many small communities, people believed that when someone died, their sins could still cling to their soul. If those sins were not removed, the spirit might struggle to find peace in the afterlife. To solve this problem, families sometimes turned to a sin-eater. During the funeral, a small piece of bread or food was placed on the chest of the deceased person. According to tradition, the bread would absorb the sins of the dead. The sin-eater would then step forward and eat the bread. By doing so, he symbolically accepted the burden of those sins and carried them away from the soul of the deceased. For the grieving family, this ritual brought comfort. It allowed them to believe that their loved one could enter the afterlife free from wrongdoing. However, The life of a sin-eater was far from easy. Although they performed a service that families requested during moments of grief, many people feared them. Some believed that sin-eaters carried the spiritual weight of countless sins taken from the dead. Others saw them as cursed individuals who dealt too closely with death and the supernatural. Because of this reputation, sin-eaters were often treated as outsiders. They usually lived on the edges of villages and towns, separated from the rest of society. Few people wanted to speak with them or invite them into their homes. Yet when a death occurred, those same communities sometimes called upon them once again. The profession was often poorly paid, and many sin-eaters lived quiet and lonely lives. Today, historians debate how widespread the practice truly was. Some records suggest it was rare, while others indicate that similar rituals existed in different forms across Europe. Regardless of how common it was, the story of the sin-eater reveals how deeply religion, fear, and tradition shaped everyday life in the past. It reminds us that for many people in earlier centuries, death was not only a physical event, but also a spiritual journey that required rituals to guide the soul safely into the next world. In crowded towns and cities of the past, one small creature caused enormous problems for everyday life. Rats were everywhere. They lived in dark alleys, inside wooden houses, beneath market stalls, and in storage buildings filled with grain and food supplies. Wherever humans lived, rats seemed to follow. These animals were more than just a nuisance. They destroyed food, chewed through containers, and contaminated supplies that entire communities depended on for survival. In a time when food shortages could easily lead to hunger or famine, losing stored grain to rats could be disastrous. Even more dangerous was the fact that rats helped spread disease. In crowded medieval towns, where sanitation was poor and waste often accumulated in the streets, rodents thrived. To deal with this constant problem, some people worked as professional rat catchers. Their job was exactly what it sounds like. Rat catchers were hired to hunt and remove rodents from homes, warehouses, markets, and farms. They used a variety of tools and techniques. Some relied on traps placed carefully along walls and dark corners where rats were known to travel. Others worked with specially trained animals. Dogs and ferrets were often used to chase rats out of hiding places and catch them quickly. The work could be dirty and unpleasant. Rat catchers often had to crawl into tight spaces beneath buildings, inside storage rooms, or among piles of garbage where rodents gathered. Despite the unpleasant nature of the job, rat catchers played an important role in protecting food supplies and reducing the spread of disease. In some cities, skilled rat catchers even became well known for their ability to control large infestations. However, the work was not without risk. Handling wild animals always carried the danger of bites or infection. Still, for many communities, the presence of a rat catcher was essential. Without them, rats could multiply quickly and create serious problems for entire towns. Today, modern sanitation and pest control methods have greatly reduced the need for such work. But in earlier centuries, the rat catcher was one of the many workers whose efforts helped keep everyday life functioning. Among the many unusual and often unsettling professions of the past, few were as feared as the role of the executioner. Executioners were responsible for carrying out punishments ordered by courts and rulers. In many medieval societies, crime was often punished harshly, and public executions were intended not only as punishment, but also as a warning to others. These events sometimes took place in town squares where large crowds gathered to watch. For many people, the executioner represented the power of the law and the authority of the ruler. Yet the life of an executioner was filled with contradictions. On one hand, Executioners performed an official duty that was necessary for the justice system of the time. Without someone willing to carry out sentences, the legal system could not function. On the other hand, most people feared them and avoided them. Because their work involved death and punishment, executioners were often treated as social outcasts. Many towns required them to live outside the city walls or in isolated areas. Ordinary citizens sometimes refused to speak with them or allow them into public spaces. Despite this social isolation, the position could offer certain advantages. Executioners were usually paid well for their work. In some regions, they were given free housing or special privileges as compensation for performing a task that few others were willing to accept. In some cases, the profession even became hereditary, passing from father to son over generations. The job itself required skill and precision. A skilled executioner was expected to perform executions quickly in order to reduce suffering. A poorly performed execution could lead to chaos in the crowd and damage the reputation of the executioner. For this reason, many executioners carefully maintained their tools and practiced their techniques. Interestingly, executioners sometimes performed other duties as well. In certain towns, they also worked as torturers during interrogations or removed animal carcasses from the streets. Though their work was grim, it was considered essential for maintaining order in medieval society. Today, the image of the executioner remains one of the most powerful symbols of justice and punishment in history. Their story reminds us that the legal systems of the past often relied on individuals willing to carry out tasks that most people preferred not to face. During the great outbreaks of disease that swept across Europe, one of the most unusual figures to appear in the streets of medieval cities was the plague doctor. These doctors were hired by towns or wealthy families to treat victims of deadly epidemics, especially during outbreaks of the Black Death. Their appearance quickly became one of the most recognizable images in medical history. Plague doctors wore long, dark coats that covered their entire bodies. Their hands were protected with gloves, and their faces were hidden behind a strange mask shaped like the beak of a bird. Inside the long beak of the mask, doctors placed herbs, spices, flowers, and sometimes pieces of cloth soaked in strong perfumes. At the time, many people believed that diseases spread through poisonous or bad air known as miasma. The scented herbs were meant to filter the air and protect the doctor from infection. Plague doctors carried special tools during their work. One of the most common was a long wooden stick. With it, they could examine patients without touching them directly. The stick was also used to keep distance from the sick. Their duties went far beyond medical treatment. Plague doctors often recorded deaths, witnessed wills, and documented the spread of disease within the city. Unfortunately, medical knowledge at the time was limited. Doctors did not yet understand bacteria or how diseases actually spread. Despite their strange clothing and unusual methods, many plague doctors risked their lives trying to help others during some of the most terrifying epidemics in history. Today, the haunting image of the beaked mask has become a powerful symbol of the fear and uncertainty that surrounded disease in the medieval world. Long before modern medical treatments were developed, doctors often relied on unusual methods to treat illness. One of the most common medical practices in Europe for centuries was bloodletting. Physicians believed that many illnesses were caused by an imbalance of fluids within the body. To restore balance, they attempted to remove blood from the patient. One of the tools used for this purpose was the leech. Leeches are small worms that attach themselves to the skin and slowly drink blood. Because of their natural ability to draw blood, doctors believed they were useful for treating a wide range of illnesses. As demand for leeches increased, a strange and uncomfortable profession appeared: The leech collector. Leech collectors spent long hours standing in cold ponds, marshes, or slow-moving rivers. Often they allowed the worms to attach directly to their legs. Once the leeches had attached themselves, the collectors carefully removed them and stored them in containers filled with water. The collected leeches were then sold to doctors, apothecaries, and hospitals. The work could be exhausting and unpleasant. Collectors often stood in freezing water for hours, and the bites could be painful. Yet leeches were valuable, and the demand for them remained strong for many years. Although medical science has advanced greatly since then, leeches are still occasionally used in certain modern surgical procedures. The strange profession of leech collecting reminds us how differently medicine once operated. Looking back at these unusual professions, it becomes clear that everyday life in the past was very different from the world we know today. Many of the comforts and technologies we now take for granted simply did not exist. There were no alarm clocks to wake workers in the morning, no modern pest control systems, and no advanced medical treatments. Because of this, people had to rely on creative and sometimes surprising solutions to solve everyday problems. Entire professions were built around tasks that modern society rarely thinks about. Some workers woke entire neighborhoods before sunrise so factory employees would not miss the beginning of their shift. Others spent long hours standing in rivers collecting leeches that doctors believed could cure illness. There were workers whose responsibility was to hunt rats that threatened food supplies. And during times of terrible disease, plague doctors walked through city streets trying to treat patients while protecting themselves with strange masks and herbal mixtures. Some of these jobs were uncomfortable, others were dangerous, and a few may even seem shocking by modern standards. Yet each of these professions served an important purpose. Without these workers, cities would have struggled to function. Food supplies could be destroyed by pests. Medical treatments would have been even more limited, and many everyday problems would have gone unsolved. These unusual jobs remind us that history is not only about kings, wars, and famous discoveries. It is also about ordinary people performing the difficult and sometimes strange work that kept their communities alive. The world of the past depended on these workers far more than we might imagine today. And while many of these professions have disappeared with the arrival of modern technology, their stories offer a fascinating glimpse into how people once lived, worked, and solved the challenges of everyday life. In the next part, we will explore even more strange professions from history, jobs that existed in royal courts, crowded cities, and hidden places that most people never saw. Some of them may be even more surprising than the ones we have already discovered.